Tonight, let your mind drift through a forgotten battlefield, a place where courage whispered louder than thunder. Under the sky of Dien, soldiers marched through mud and silence, not for glory, but for the simple dream of coming home. Here, in Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, we don't tell stories of empires or conquests. We tell the stories of hearts, of those who endured, who sang beneath the rain, and who found peace not in victory, but in remembering. As you close your eyes tonight, listen to the wind that once carried the sound of distant drums. Every breath, every step, every echo in the valley is a lullaby from the past, a quiet song of resilience, whispered by those who refuse to be forgotten. Welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, where history dreams, and dreams remember. I was born long after the first cannons roared, but my father said the air itself remembered that morning, September 1858, when thunder came from the sea. He said the birds vanished, and the river turned still, as if listening to something ancient waking again. It was not a storm. It was the beginning of a century of storms. That day, French ships opened their guns on the harbor at Dien, and the sound, my father whispered, never truly stopped. It only changed shape, echoing through decades, through generations, until it found me. When I was young, I imagined that sound, not as explosions, but as a single heartbeat carried by the land itself. The first heartbeat of a sleeping nation being woken by violence. Do you hear it too? I used to ask the night, would you have known it was the start of something that would last 100 years? My father had been a boy in a fishing village then, a place that smelled of salt, smoke, and wet rope. He told me about the morning when black iron ships rose from the mist, their flags snapping in the monsoon wind, their cannons gleaming like eyes that had no mercy. The villagers had never seen such machines. Some knelt and prayed, others ran, but my father said the sea itself looked frightened. The French came not as guests, but as owners. They built forts where shrines had stood, churches where rice fields once glowed green. They spoke of civilization and salvation, but their hands reached for rubber, gold, and souls. And the land, our land, groaned under their weight. My father never held a gun, but he fought in other ways. He hid rice from tax collectors, whispered poems forbidden by the officials, and once helped a wounded rebel escape through the mangroves. He said, "The war is not only fought by men with rifles, it's also fought by those who refuse to forget who they are." I didn't understand then. I do now. He died before I went to war myself, but I think of him often. How he described that first thunder. How he believed that even silence could resist if it remembered. That's why I started telling these stories, not for glory, not for victory, but so that the silence would not win. When I close my eyes, I can still see his face in the half-light of our hut, the oil lamp flickering, his voice low and steady. Outside, rain fell on the thatched roof, and the smell of wet earth drifted in. He would say, "This land has a long memory, my son. It remembers every drop of blood, every tear, every lie." Then he would smile faintly and add, "But it also remembers hope." Do you believe that, listener? That the earth can remember hope? Or does it only remember pain? Tonight, as you lie still, imagine standing beside that old fisherman on the shore. The sky is gray, the sea wide and breathing. In the distance, faint shapes of ships begin to rise, tall, black, and unfamiliar. You don't yet know their names, or the language of the men aboard. You only know that the wind has changed, and that the peace of your world will soon become a story whispered to children who have never known it. The first gunfire I never heard still echoes in my dreams, not because I lived through it, but because I lived in the world it created, a world where thunder came from men, and silence became the only weapon that time could not take from us. Close your eyes and listen. The war has not begun yet, but the earth already knows what's coming. My grandfather was only 16 when he first saw Saigon. He came down the river on a barge full of rice sacks, his hands still smelling of mud and riverweed. The city was nothing like his village. It was loud, alive, and already half foreign. European traders moved through the markets like ghosts wrapped in linen, and priests with white collars spoke of heaven in a tongue that no one could understand. But my grandfather said what he remembered most was the harbor, the rows of masts, the glint of cannon barrels, and the taste of iron in the air. He told me that even then, Saigon felt as if it belonged to someone else. The flags that fluttered above the ships were not ours. The orders shouted across the docks came from mouths that had never spoken our names right. Yet the locals kept working, carrying crates, polishing decks, bowing low, as though obedience could save them from what was coming. He once worked for a French quartermaster, a man with polished boots and a smile like a blade. Every morning, he was ordered to scrub the deck until it shone bright enough to reflect the sky. One day, he looked down into the reflection and saw his own face instead, tired, dark, and thin, and he realized that the sea he served no longer belonged to him. That was the day I stopped believing they would ever leave, he told me. Once a man builds a fort on your land, he builds one in your soul too. He watched Saigon grow, faster than the forest could fall. Timber ships brought in soldiers, traders, and nuns. Ships leaving carried out rice, pepper, and silence. Streets widened, temples shrank, and the city began to glow at night with the strange light of oil lamps that smelled of Europe. But even among the foreign noise, he said the river still spoke in our language. It whispered to the mangroves, carried the laughter of fishermen, and reminded him that the tide always returns, no matter who commands it. Sometimes, he'd walk to the edge of the harbor and watch the sun sink behind the masts. He'd see French sailors drinking, priests praying, and beggars sleeping under the shadow of the flag. He once told me, "Empires are built like ships, bright on the surface, rotten below the deck." He said the wood creaked differently at night, as if the harbor itself wanted to cry out. But no one dared to listen. Would you have listened? If you stood beside him that evening, if you smelled the smoke of coal and gunpowder mixing with salt and rain, would you have known what those ships meant? Would you have understood that every plank of their hull carried the weight of centuries to come? He said one night, a storm came, fierce and unending. Lightning flashed across the water, and for a brief moment, the ships looked like ghosts caught between two worlds. He prayed it would sink them all, but when the dawn came, the sky was clear, and the French flag still fluttered proudly above the fort. That was when he understood. Storms could wash away men, but not power. Not yet. When I was a boy, he would sit by the riverbank, his hands trembling, and tell me stories of Saigon Harbor as if it were a living thing, a creature breathing through centuries, swallowing every ship that dared to enter. He said, "Remember this, child. The sea always gives, but it never forgets." Sometimes I wonder if the harbor still remembers him, a 16-year-old boy with river mud on his feet, watching his country disappear behind sails and smoke. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the chains clinking, the waves lapping against iron hulls, and a boy's heart breaking beneath the hum of a new empire. The world called it progress. He called it the day the water turned heavy, the day when the sea itself began to dream of rebellion. When I was a child, my mother's hands always smelled of sap, not the sweet kind that drips from forest trees. This one was sharp, bitter, like something wounded. She worked in the plantations north of Saigon, where the French grew their empire from the blood of the poor. Every morning before dawn, she walked barefoot through the mist, carrying a dull knife and a tin cup. By the time the sun rose, hundreds of women were already bent like shadows, cutting thin white scars into endless rows of rubber trees. The plantation was quiet except for the sound of dripping, drop after drop, like a slow clock, counting the hours of their lives away. She used to say the forest never forgave them. The trees bled and the ground drank, and the overseers shouted in a language that didn't belong to the wind. At night, when the women returned to the huts, their clothes smelled of sweat and iron and the faint sweetness of pain. And when the rain came, as it always did, the fields turned to rivers, washing away the footprints, but not the exhaustion. I remember once she told me, "This land gives everything, but it asks for everything in return." I didn't understand what she meant until years later, when I held a rifle made from the same metal that once cut those trees. There were men who disappeared in those fields, some from fever, some from exhaustion, some because they dared to whisper the word freedom. The French called them agitators. We called them brothers. My mother said the jungle kept their names, that if you listened closely, you could hear the leaves whisper the syllables of the dead. Sometimes, I still wonder if the trees remember her. The way her blade trembled when she was too tired to cut. The way she looked up at the sky and mouthed prayers she no longer believed in. The plantation stretched as far as the eye could see. A man-made forest built on obedience and silence. But silence, like sap, can turn thick and heavy when it's wounded. Have you ever walked through a place that feels alive, where every step seems to echo with something unsaid? Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. Rows of trees standing like soldiers, their bark striped and bandaged, their tears caught in metal cups shining under the rain. Do you think they knew what they were growing? Not just rubber, but rebellion? At night, my mother would hum old songs, lullabies from before the war, songs the French never understood. They sounded like the rustle of dry leaves, like the whisper of a dream refusing to die. And sometimes, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her say softly, "One day, these hands will plant something that belongs to us." Years later, when I joined the army, I thought about that promise. Every drop of sweat on my forehead, every heartbeat in the jungle, felt like another seed she had planted, a seed of defiance. I never told her, but when I fired my rifle for the first time, I whispered, "For Yumi." The French built their fortunes on those plantations, on latex that fed their factories in Paris and Marseille. But what they could never see was what grew beneath. Anger, unity, memory. Rubber trees can't speak, but they remember every wound. And so did we. When I walk through forests now, I still smell the sap. I still see her hands. And I still hear the drip, the sound of a nation bleeding slowly into history, waiting for someone to notice. Would you have noticed? Would you have heard the sound of sap? Or would you have mistaken it for rain? I still remember the smell of chalk, that, and the sound of French syllables echoing through the classroom like tiny bells, sharp, clean, and foreign. Our teacher was a priest, with pale eyes and hands that trembled when he spoke. He said the words liberté, égalité, fraternité, as if they were prayers. We repeated them after him, not knowing that one day we would bleed for the same ideals he claimed to teach us. The school was built on what used to be a pagoda. They tore down the statues and replaced them with portraits of men in wigs. We sat on benches too tall for our legs, our bare feet swinging above the floor, while maps of France hung on the walls, rivers, cities, colonies marked in red. Vietnam was only a small corner, shaded pale, as if even on paper we were meant to be forgotten. At the start, I liked the sound of their language. It rolled like a song, and when the priest spoke about Paris, I imagined a city made of light. He said it was the heart of civilization, and that one day, perhaps, we too could become civilized. I was 10, and I believed him. Children always believe the ones who smile while stealing their names. But as I grew older, the words began to change shape. They no longer sounded like music. They sounded like commands. The more I learned their history, the more I realized we were not part of it. We were only the footnotes. Our own heroes, our poets, our kings, erased or mocked. Once, I asked why we had to learn about Joan of Arc, but not the Trung sisters. The priest frowned and said, "Because yours were rebels, not saints." That night, I stopped doing my prayers. Do you remember the first time you realized a story wasn't written for you? That the heroes you were told to admire would have called your ancestors savages? It's a strange kind of awakening. Quiet, bitter, and impossible to forget. They told us to write essays about loyalty. So I wrote one about loyalty to the land, to the river, to my mother who worked the fields. The priest tore it in half. He said loyalty belonged to the empire, not to the soil. He said the soul of a man must be baptized by knowledge, and knowledge came only from France. I wanted to shout at him, but I didn't. I just watched the dust rise from my torn paper and thought of the old pagoda that once stood here. Maybe the statues were still buried somewhere beneath the floor. Listening. Years later, when I joined the resistance, I met others like me, men and women who had learned French perfectly, but spoke it only to dismantle it. We used their words to write our manifestos, their education to build our revolution. It was the greatest irony. The colonizer had taught us the language we would use to tell them to leave. Sometimes, I still hear that priest's voice in my dreams, soft, uncertain, saying liberté, and I whisper back, "We learned it, Father. We just gave it back its meaning." If someone took your name, would you remember who you were? If they gave you their words, would you still find your own voice? The lesson stayed with me long after the school crumbled. That freedom cannot be taught in another language. You must speak it in your own. It began with a whisper, not a shout, not a gunshot, just a whisper passed from hand to hand, folded into the corners of rice sacks, hidden under school books, read by candlelight in rooms where no one dared to breathe too loud. They were letters, written in a language that seemed both strange and familiar. At the bottom, there was always the same name, When I Quack. No one knew who he truly was then. Some said he was a teacher, others said a sailor, a poet, or a ghost from the future. But to us, he was the first man who dared to speak aloud what everyone else only dreamed. My friend Loy brought me my first pamphlet. He handed it to me wrapped in old newspaper and said, "Read it only when the rain starts." So I waited for the storm. That night, lightning flashed through the shutters, and by its light I read the words that would change my life. The people of Vietnam must stand, not kneel. The world has many empires, but only one truth, that those who labor shall one day be free. The ink was faded, but the fire in the words was not. Each sentence felt like a wound opening and healing at the same time. I remember touching the page, afraid that even my breath might erase it. In the weeks that followed, the letters spread like wind through bamboo. Farmers whispered them in the fields. Students copied them onto scraps of paper, and monks hid them inside scripture rolls. The French called it sedition. We called it hope. Have you ever felt a single sentence change the rhythm of your heart? As if the world you thought you knew was suddenly too small for your dreams? That was how it felt. We began to look at our land differently, not as a prison, but as something that could be reclaimed. Even the air seemed to shift, as though it too was waiting for permission to breathe freely again. One night, a man came through our village. He wore simple clothes, carried no weapon, and spoke softly. He told stories about Paris, not of its beauty, but of its hypocrisy. He said, "They talk about liberty, yet they build chains across the sea." When someone asked his name, he only smiled and said, "Just call me Nguyen." Then he disappeared into the night. We never saw him again. But after that, the letters multiplied. I joined a small circle of students and workers who met behind the market after dusk. We read those pamphlets together, our voices trembling, not from fear but from something larger, the sense that history had finally noticed us, that our suffering was not invisible anymore, that someone somewhere was writing our names into the future. The French police came soon after. They raided houses, burned papers, and dragged men away. But by then, it was too late. The idea had already taken root. And once an idea is planted in the soil of hunger and memory, no empire can dig it out. Would you have risked your life for a few pieces of paper? For words that might never change anything, except the way your heart beats? Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those letters fluttering through the wind like tiny birds, each one carrying the same message, that the chains were not permanent, and that someday, even a poor boy with calloused hands could stand tall beneath the same sun. The name, When I Quack, became more than a man. It became a direction, a promise, a quiet voice whispering across the years. We are not done yet. And that whisper, that fragile thing born in the dark, would grow louder than any cannon. The morning he left, the river was still. No wind, no ripples, no sound but the creak of ropes and the low hum of the tide. The boy everyone called when stood at the dock with nothing but a satchel and the kind of silence that follows conviction. He didn't say farewell. He just stepped onto the ship as if he'd been walking toward it all his life. My uncle told me he was barely 30 then, thin, serious, his eyes burning with something that looked like grief and hope mixed together. No one in the village knew exactly where he was going. They only knew why. He said he had to see the world that claimed to rule us, to stand in its streets, breathe its air, and ask why liberty stopped at the borders of our skin. The ship's whistle sounded like a cry that wouldn't end. Women waved scarves from the dock. Children ran along the pier, shouting his name. But he didn't turn back. He just looked out toward the gray horizon and whispered, "If freedom lives anywhere, I'll find it." For weeks, he disappeared into the sea. Men who worked on cargo ships said he mopped floors and peeled potatoes to pay his passage. At night, he stood on deck watching the stars and wondered if they looked the same from home. He wrote letters that never arrived, words swallowed by the ocean, about storms and hunger and the strange loneliness of chasing an idea across the world. When the ship reached Marseille, he stepped onto the dock barefoot. Europe, the empire that had conquered his homeland, smelled of coal, wet stone, and arrogance. He saw churches taller than temples, and beggars with skin as pale as the moon. He learned that even here, the poor had no voice. Only the language of power changed. He worked in kitchens, cleaned hotel floors, and at night attended meetings of students and workers from Africa and Asia. Men with different faces, but the same wounds. They spoke of equality and justice, but when they mentioned the colonies, the room grew quiet. He realized then that the empire had built its greatness on silence, the silence of those too far away to be heard. One night, he wrote in his journal, "I came here to seek freedom. I found it caged behind gold gates." Have you ever gone so far to find truth, only to discover it was never yours to keep? Would you still keep walking, even if every road led back to loss? He wandered the streets of Paris during winter, his breath fogging the air as he watched people hurry past shop windows glowing with light. He thought of the villages back home, of his mother's hands, the smell of rice husks, the sound of rain on banana leaves. He wrote again, "They call this civilization, but they have forgotten compassion." He began sending letters, petitions, essays, manifestos, to anyone who would read them. Each one was signed simply, "When I quack." Each one a reminder that the colonized were not faceless, that the silence had learned to speak. When news of his writings reached the village, the French officials raided homes and burned pamphlets. But my uncle kept one scrap of a newspaper clipping hidden inside a rice jar. It said, "A young Annamite agitator in Paris calls for independence." He smiled when he read it and whispered, he found freedom, not for himself, but for us. I often wonder what he felt on that ship, watching the horizon vanish behind smoke and distance. Did he know he was leaving forever? Did he know that every wave carried him further from the life he was born to protect, and closer to the destiny that would change us all? When I stand near the river now, I sometimes imagine that same ship fading into the mist, its sails glowing like ghosts under the morning sun, and I hear his voice, carried by the wind. Don't wait for the world to give you justice. Make the world remember your name. He left without goodbye, because goodbye is for those who plan to return. He never did, but he sent back something greater than himself, a reason to keep fighting. They said he returned through the mountains, under a moon that hid behind clouds. No one saw him arrive, they only felt the air change. The villagers whispered, "On wind de tiro." To us, it sounded like the wind announcing rain after 100 seasons of drought. I was still a boy then, carrying water from the well when I first heard his name. The elders spoke of him as though he were part legend, part prophecy, the man who had walked through the empires and come back with the secret of how to break them. Some said he had studied in France, others that he had written letters to kings and workers alike. But when he spoke, they said, it was not the voice of Europe that came through. It was the voice of the soil itself. He stayed hidden in the caves of the north, Viet back, a land where mist clings to the trees and the earth smells of moss and gunpowder. They say he wrote by the light of a single oil lamp, his breath visible in the cold, his words flowing like rivers through the darkness. He spoke of unity, of farmers and workers standing as one. He said that independence was not a dream, it was a duty. I remember the first time I saw his face. He was smaller than I imagined, his beard silvered, his eyes calm but piercing, like someone who had seen too much of both kindness and cruelty. When he smiled, it was not with triumph, but with patience. He said, "The French think we fight them for land. We fight them for dignity, and dignity cannot be conquered." The jungle became our classroom, and his voice, our textbook. We learned to read maps drawn on banana leaves, to write slogans on rice paper that dissolved in rain, to carry messages folded inside the lining of our clothes. Every tree became a lookout post, every path a lifeline. Every night, we went to sleep wondering if we'd wake up free. Can you imagine fighting for something you've never seen? A freedom that exists only in stories and in the way the wind feels when no one is watching. We followed him even when we didn't fully understand his vision, because he made us believe that understanding wasn't necessary, only faith. He said, "You will not see victory, but your children will, and that will be enough." When the French planes came, we hid beneath the bamboo and watched bombs carve open the earth. The ground shook, but his voice never did. He spoke of the world beyond, of China, Russia, and other revolutions that had once seemed impossible. He made us believe ours wasn't madness. It was destiny. I remember the night he read aloud the Declaration of Independence, his words drifting through the jungle like prayer smoke. We had no paper large enough, no microphone, no crowd, only the sound of rain on leaves and the steady beat of our hearts. He read slowly, in both French and Vietnamese, as if to remind us that the Empire's language would now carry our truth. Do you think the world was listening? Or did the jungle keep our secret until we could shout it loud enough to be heard? When dawn came, we saw the mist lifting over the hills, and for the first time, I believed we might live to see the morning of our own choosing. He looked out toward the east, where the light crawled through the clouds, and whispered, "This land has waited long enough." We didn't know then that the hardest part was still to come, that the enemy would return, stronger, angrier, hungrier for control. But that morning, it didn't matter. The wanderer had come home, and for the first time in a century, Vietnam breathed like it belonged to itself again. It rained that morning, not a storm, just the kind of soft rain that feels like breath. Hanoi shimmered beneath it, streets glistening, rooftops dripping, and yet the square, Dien, was already full before the sun rose. People came barefoot, carrying umbrellas, wearing conical hats patched with hope. They came from fields, factories, and alleys, faces still hollow from hunger, but eyes alive in a way I had never seen before. I stood near the back, my rifle slung across my shoulder, boots heavy with mud from the march south. The rain soaked my uniform, but I didn't care, because that day, we were not soldiers or peasants or prisoners anymore. We were a people. Then silence, a kind of silence I've never heard since. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. Through the mist, he appeared, the old man with the thin frame, the wispy beard, the simple khaki tunic. No medals, no throne, just back ho, walking slowly to the wooden podium. And when he spoke, it felt as if the land itself exhaled for the first time in 100 years. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He paused, The words were not ours. They came from somewhere far away, from a nation that had once called itself free while helping to keep us chained. But in his mouth, they belonged to us now. I looked around. Old women were crying. Children sat on their father's shoulders, wide-eyed and silent. Even the French colonial buildings seemed to hold their breath. For a moment, the rain stopped, as if the sky itself wanted to listen. Then came the cheer, a sound so vast, it seemed to rise straight through the clouds. Someone began singing, and within seconds, the whole square joined in. Voices cracked, off-key, and trembling with joy. I remember clutching my rifle to my chest, whispering to myself, "This is it. This is the beginning." But even in that moment, I saw what others didn't. The foreign officers watching from the edges, their expressions polite but cold. The banners that flapped proudly beside our new flag, already beginning to tear in the wind. And the rain, it returned, heavier now, washing the red dye from the paper flags into streaks of pink on the pavement. Freedom, I realized, was not a gift you could unwrap in one morning. It was something you had to hold on to, while the storm tried to take it away. That night, the celebrations continued. Lanterns floated on the river. Fireworks cracked like echoes of distant battles. I sat beneath an awning, cleaning my rifle by candlelight. Across the street, a girl sold roasted corn, humming a folk tune from the north. For a moment, everything felt simple. The smell of smoke, the laughter, the taste of rain. Then a messenger arrived. His uniform was soaked, his face pale. He handed our commander a sealed envelope. I watched as the smile vanished from the man's face. The note said French troops had landed in the south. The British were escorting them, and soon the war would begin again. I remember looking up at the flag above Dien. It still fluttered, bright and defiant against the black sky. And I whispered, "Even if it falls, we'll lift it again." Have you ever known joy so pure that it hurts? Have you ever celebrated freedom while hearing war's footsteps approaching? That was our Independence Day. Beautiful, fragile, soaked in rain and blood yet to come. And though I did not know it then, that red flag would follow me through jungles, over rivers, and into nightmares, its color deepening with every drop of sacrifice. They said peace would last, that the French would leave quietly, and we'd build our country from the ashes. But peace, I've learned, is just the space between gunfire, and that space never lasts long. It began with whispers, rumors that foreign ships had returned to Saigon, their decks heavy with soldiers and flags that once ruled us. Then came the orders, cautious at first, then urgent. Prepare the defenses, reinforce Hanoi. I remember that December night in 1946. Cold wind carried the smell of coal and fear. Street lamps flickered across the narrow alleys of the old quarter, casting long shadows that swayed like ghosts. The trams still ran, but they no longer rang their bells. Everyone was waiting for something we couldn't name, but everyone felt. Our unit was stationed near Hangdao. We were boys, some barely 17. Our rifles older than our fathers. The commander whispered, "Hold the line if they come. If they take Hanoi tonight, there'll be no tomorrow." When the first explosion hit, it was near the power plant. A flash of light split the night, followed by a roar that shook the windows from their frames. The city went dark, and in that darkness, the war began again. We fired from behind sandbags and crumbling walls, our bullets tracing lines of light through the black. The French had tanks, machine guns, mortars. We had courage, and that was enough for the moment. Every shot echoed down the streets we'd grown up in, bouncing off temples, markets, and homes that had become fortresses overnight. I saw a boy from my village, Ben, the one who used to sing at harvest festivals, crouching behind a broken tram, his hands trembling as he reloaded. He looked at me and smiled. "Can you believe it, On? We're fighting in our own streets." A moment later, a shell hit nearby. When the dust cleared, he was gone. We fought for days that felt like years. Each street became a battlefield. Each intersection a monument of resistance. The smell of gunpowder mixed with jasmine and smoke. We moved through the sewers, carried messages under fire, and whispered passwords through cracked doors. Old men handed us rice balls and whispered prayers. Women tore up sheets to make bandages. Children watched from basements, eyes wide with a kind of silent bravery I still can't forget. At dawn on the fourth day, I climbed to a rooftop. From there, I saw Hanoi burning, its flames curling around church spires, its smoke painting the sky red and gray. And yet, in that ruin, there was beauty, because for the first time, the city was truly ours. Have you ever loved something so much that you'd watch it burn, just to keep it from being taken? We knew we couldn't hold the capital forever. The French were too many, too well armed. But every hour we resisted was a victory of its own. When the order finally came, withdraw to the jungle, regroup. None of us wanted to leave. We buried our dead in the courtyards of temples and promised we'd come back for them as we slipped into the night, crossing the Red River on makeshift boats. I looked back one last time. The city glowed behind us, a sea of fire and memory, and I thought of Flag and Dien, how it had once shimmered in the rain. Now we left Hanoi under a moon that refused to shine. The city smoldered behind us, red, broken, and proud. We didn't look back, not because we weren't afraid to, but because turning around would make it harder to keep walking. The road north was not a road at all, just a scar through the hills. Every step felt like leaving a piece of ourselves behind. The sound of trams, the smell of coffee, the laughter of people who still believed in normal mornings. Now our world was mud, mist, and the whisper of boots against wet leaves. We carried everything on our backs, rifles, rice, and the weight of promises. Those who had shoes shared them. Those who didn't walk barefoot, their feet bleeding, but their hearts strangely light. Someone joked, "We'll walk until the earth remembers our names." No one laughed, but we all smiled. At night, the forest came alive. Frogs sang like drums. Crickets stitched the darkness together. We built fires so small their smoke wouldn't betray us. Huddled close for warmth, for courage, for a sense that the world hadn't forgotten us. Sometimes, the commander read aloud from a crumpled notebook, letters from villages we'd left behind. They said, "Keep fighting. We are with you." And though the paper trembled in his hands, his voice never did. I remember one night most clearly. It rained hard, the kind of rain that feels like punishment. Our trench filled with mud up to our knees. I sat beside an old sergeant, his uniform torn, his face calm as stone. He looked at me and said, "Young man, do you know why we march barefoot?" I shook my head. He smiled faintly, "So we can feel the land we're fighting for." That night, I dreamt of the city, but it wasn't burning anymore. The rain had washed the smoke away, and in its place, green shoots grew between the ruins. When I woke up, dawn was breaking, pale and quiet. The jungle smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Have you ever walked until you forgot who you were, and only remembered what you believed in? Have you ever been so hungry that even hope tasted like food? By the third week, our numbers had thinned. Some fell ill. Some disappeared into the forest, claimed by fever or by despair. But each dawn, someone still hummed an old folk song. Each night, someone still whispered, "We'll come back." That was how we measured strength, not by how far we walked, but by how much of ourselves we still carried inside. When we reached the mountains of Viet back, the fog swallowed us whole. But to us, it felt like being embraced. We were home, not the home of comfort, but of purpose. The air smelled of wood smoke and determination. Villagers met us with bowls of thin porridge and eyes full of belief. They didn't ask if we'd won. They only asked if we'd keep going. We said yes. That night, as I sat beneath a canopy of bamboo, I looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched us flee, the same ones that had shone over the city's flames. And for the first time, I realized we hadn't escaped. We had transformed. The jungle wasn't a hiding place. It was a womb. And from it, something new was being born. Have you ever walked into the dark, only to find it was the place you were meant to begin? We were no longer running. We were waiting, sharpening our resolve like knives in the rain. Someday, we'd return to the city we left behind. And when we did, the world would know we never stopped walking. The jungle had its own heartbeat. You could hear it if you stayed still long enough. The rustle of bamboo, the steady drip of dew, the soft murmur of wind moving through the leaves like a secret language. We built our world there, hidden beneath canopies so thick that even sunlight had to ask permission to enter. The caves became our homes, our schools, our sanctuaries. We carved desks from stone, inked words on scraps of old newspapers, and wrote with brushes made from bamboo and charcoal. We studied by firelight, the smoke blurring our vision, but not our resolve. At night, voices rose from the darkness. Stories of battles fought, comrades lost. Dreams of the day we would return to the cities we'd left behind. We told them not to forget the roads, not to forget the sound of laughter in the markets, or the smell of the Red River in the morning. Those memories were the only things that kept us human. One evening, word spread that Baco would speak. We gathered beneath a canvas stretched between two trees, rain dripping through the holes, our faces lit by a single lantern that swayed in the breeze. He sat on a wooden chair, small and quiet, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes the color of the earth after rain. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He spoke softly, and yet his words reached every corner of the forest. He said, "Comrades, we are fighting a long war. The French have machines, but we have time. They have power, but we have the people. And history has always belonged to those who endure." Silence followed, not because we didn't understand, but because the truth felt too heavy to speak back to. I looked around and saw faces glistening with sweat and tears, young and old, soldiers and farmers, each of us holding those words like fire in our hands. Afterward, someone asked him, "Back, when will the war end?" He smiled gently. When the people no longer asked that question, he said, "That night, we returned to our caves, and the rain began again, soft, endless, like the rhythm of breath. I lay on the cold ground, listening to the drops hitting the stone above me, and realized those caves weren't prisons. They were lungs, breathing life into a nation reborn through endurance. Have you ever heard hope echo off stone walls? Have you ever felt history whisper in the dark, telling you not to give up? We trained by day and dreamed by night. Children brought us food hidden in bamboo baskets. Elders told tales of ancestors who fought invaders centuries ago. Every story became another reason to keep going. We learned patience from the forest. That victory grows the same way as bamboo. Slowly, silently, and all at once. Sometimes I would write letters I could never send. To my mother, to the city, to the river. I'd tell them I was still alive, that we were still here, that someday the silence would end. And though no one would ever read those letters, writing them made the distance feel smaller. When dawn came, the mist would roll in like smoke, and from the hilltops we could see the first light spill through the valleys. That was enough. We didn't need promises. We had purpose. In the cave, our weapons rusted and our paper ran out, but our faith did not. We were building something bigger than an army. We were building a memory the world would never erase. The river had always been quiet, a silver thread winding through valleys of mist and bamboo. But that morning, it burned. I remember the air thick with humidity, the smell of wet soil and gun oil. We had spent days digging trenches into the hillsides, hiding among banana trees and rocks, our rifles covered with leaves, our breaths measured. The French convoy would come, we knew that much. They always followed the river. They trusted the water to carry them home. We trusted it to deliver them to us. The fog was our ally. From across the water, we could hear engines humming, the low metallic drone of gunboats. like a heartbeat too steady to be human. Someone whispered, "It's time." And for a moment, even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then, the first explosion. A column of fire shot into the air, and the river that had been calm just seconds before roared like a creature awakened. Boats split open like tin cans, their silhouettes vanishing into smoke. We fired from both banks, rifles, mortars, even handmade grenades. The sound rolled through the valley, echoing like thunder trapped in the mountains. I could see the faces of the enemy through the haze. Young men like us, terrified, screaming, trying to steer through the flames. And for a fleeting second, I almost pitied them. War has a way of making mirrors out of enemies. But pity has no place on the battlefield. When they fired back, we pressed our bodies against the mud, feeling bullets tear through leaves inches above our heads. One comrade, Fuck, stood up to throw a grenade and was struck before his arm could fall. He didn't scream. He just smiled and whispered, "Tell my mother it worked." The grenade found its mark. The gunboat went under. By afternoon, the river was littered with debris, smoking planks, helmets, the ghostly reflection of burning oil. The French retreated, their pride sinking faster than their boats. We stayed hidden, watching the fire spread across the current, lighting up the gray sky with streaks of orange. Have you ever seen hope burn brighter than fear? Have you ever realized that victory can come from patience, not power? That night, we gathered around a small fire far from the riverbank. The commander read the names of the fallen. We bowed our heads, not in sorrow, but in gratitude, because every name he read was a stone laid in the foundation of something larger than ourselves. Someone began humming a folk tune, a lullaby our mothers used to sing when we were children. Soon the whole camp joined in. The melody drifted through the forest, soft, slow, like the river after the storm. The next morning, I went down to the water's edge. The smoke had cleared. Fish floated belly up in the shallow pools, and the surface shimmered red in the sunrise. It looked like the river was bleeding, but it wasn't defeat. It was transformation. For the first time, we had proof that courage could break machines, that unity could bend steel, that the impossible was only impossible until it wasn't. I cupped a handful of river water and drank. It tasted of ash and rain and victory, and I thought, if this is what freedom costs, then I will pay it again and again and again. Would you have believed, then, that a handful of barefoot soldiers could make the world listen? We were no longer the hunted. We were the storm. And the river, the same river that once carried invaders, now carried our story. The first winter in the mountains came quietly, not with snow, but with silence, the kind that seeps into your bones, where even breath feels like it might shatter if you speak too loudly. We called it the winter without light, not because the sun stopped rising, but because its warmth never reached us. The fires we built were too small, the food too little, the nights too long. We slept in bamboo huts patched with leaves and hope, our blankets made of gunny sacks and old uniforms. Each morning, we woke to frost clinging to the inside of our roofs, and each evening, we went to sleep wondering if the next dawn would still find us breathing. Hunger was the worst of it, the kind of hunger that hollowed out your strength and your thoughts at once. We chewed on roasted corn, sometimes only a handful of rice between 10 men, but we never spoke of quitting, because the thought of surrender tasted worse than starvation. Sometimes, Backhoe would send letters, handwritten, carried by messengers through forests and rivers. He told us to eat less, but believe more. To keep faith as you would keep a fire under the rain. We did. Some nights, that faith was the only thing that fed us. One evening, a comrade named Tuan collapsed near the cooking fire. We tried to wake him, but he just smiled faintly and whispered, "I'm warm now." Then he was gone. We buried him beneath a tree that leaned toward the valley, and used his canteen to collect rainwater. No one cried. We couldn't afford to. Tears froze faster than courage. Have you ever been so cold that you start to forget the sound of your own heartbeat? Have you ever loved something enough to die freezing just to keep it alive? Sometimes, when the fog lifted, we could see the Red River far to the south, a thin silver line between the hills. And though it was miles away, we looked toward it and whisper, "That's where Hanoi sleeps. We'll wake her one day." At night, we took turns guarding the camp. The stars were bright, cruelly bright, as if mocking the darkness we lived in. I remember sitting beside the fire, rubbing my hands together, thinking about my mother back home. She used to light incense before the altar every winter solstice, murmuring prayers to ancestors I barely remembered. That night, I whispered my own prayer, not for warmth, not for food, but for strength to last until spring. When the first blossoms finally appeared, tiny white flowers pushing through the frost, the whole camp gathered around them. We didn't touch them. We just watched, because in that fragile bloom, we saw something we hadn't seen in months. Proof that life still remembered us. Can you imagine finding hope in a single flower? Can you believe that survival itself can feel like victory? By the time the thaw came, we were thinner, quieter, older in ways no one could see. But we were also sharper, tempered like steel. The winter hadn't broken us. It had refined us. When orders came to move south again, no one hesitated. We packed our rifles, buried what we couldn't carry, and looked once more toward the horizon. The sky was gray, but somewhere beneath that grayness, we knew the dawn was waiting. And as we marched out of the frozen valley, someone began to sing. A rough, cracked voice at first, then another joined, and another, until the mountains themselves seemed to hum along. The winter without light had ended, and in its place, a fire none of us could see, but all of us could feel, kept burning quietly, for Hanoi, for freedom, for the promise that no season lasts forever. The jungle no longer slept. Every sound had meaning now. The crack of a twig, the flap of a bird's wings. Even the wind brushing against leaves could make a man's heart race. They were coming. We all knew it. Whispers traveled faster than gunfire. The French are marching north. Planes, paratroopers, artillery. They wanted to crush Viet back once and for all. They wanted to cut the heart out of the resistance. But they didn't know the heart had learned to move. We dismantled everything. The printing presses, the radio, the workshops, all carried deep into the forest, hidden beneath layers of bamboo and vines. The earth swallowed our footprints. The rivers erased our scent. If the enemy wanted to find us, they would have to search every leaf, every cave, every shadow. The days became heavy with waiting. We spoke little. Even laughter could betray us. At night, the jungle glowed faintly with fireflies, tiny sparks of light daring to exist despite the darkness. Sometimes, I thought we were like them, small, fragile, but refusing to disappear. When the attack finally came, it began with the sky. The roar of engines tore through the silence, followed by the shriek of falling bombs. The ground trembled, trees cracked like bones, and the air turned to smoke and thunder. We scattered, each man to his position, each heartbeat a drum counting down to survival. The French dropped paratroopers across the valley, their white canopies blooming like poisonous flowers. From afar, it looked almost beautiful, death descending gracefully. But beauty dies quickly in war. We fired from the hillsides, rifles echoing against the cliffs. They tried to advance through the ravines, but the jungle fought with us. Roots tangled their boots. Mud swallowed their trucks. Mist blinded their scopes. They had maps, but the land had changed its language. One evening, as rain poured down in silver sheets, I lay in the mud beside my comrade Lamb. He was younger than me, barely 19, his face streaked with dirt and rainwater. He whispered, "Do you think they know we're watching them?" I nodded. They'll never see us, but they'll feel us. That night, we ambushed their convoy, a line of trucks crawling along the narrow road like insects. We waited until the first headlights cut through the fog, then struck. Grenades, gunfire, the echo of explosions bouncing off the cliffs. The jungle lit up, green and orange and violet. For a few minutes, the world was nothing but sound and smoke. When it ended, the silence was louder than before. Bodies lay among the broken trucks, their shadows blending with the mud. We buried our own before dawn. No graves, no names, just a promise whispered to the earth. We'll finish what you started. Have you ever fought in darkness so deep that you forget what daylight feels like? Have you ever learned that courage isn't loud? It's the quiet act of not running. By the time the French realized they were fighting ghosts, we were already gone. They bombed empty hills, searched caves that only held echoes. Their maps told them they had advanced, but the land itself disagreed. Weeks passed. The offensive began to crumble. Their supplies stretched thin. Their men lost in terrain that devoured whole battalions. They came to find us, and instead found themselves lost. When the order finally came to retreat, we watched from the trees as they marched south again, exhausted, bleeding, their uniforms shredded by the jungle's patience. We didn't cheer. We just watched, breathing quietly. Victory, we learned, doesn't always sound like applause. Sometimes, it's just the whisper of rain falling on leaves, and the knowledge that the enemy has turned away. That night, we returned to the cave. Someone had brought a radio, still working despite the moisture. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. Viet back stands firm. The enemy has failed. We didn't shout. We just smiled. A slow, tired smile that said, "We are still here." And that is enough. After the battle, the jungle grew quiet again. Not the kind of silence that follows death, but the soft, breathing stillness of life returning. We rebuilt our camp piece by piece. Bamboo walls, thatched roofs, cooking fires that smoked but never betrayed our position. The war still raged beyond the hills. But here, under the canopy, there was peace of a different kind. The peace of the living who refused to surrender. The soldiers joked again. We cooked what little we had. Cassava, wild roots, the occasional squirrel or bird. Laughter came easily, as though the earth itself wanted us to remember what it meant to be human. One evening, someone brought a mandolin. The strings were rusted, two were missing, but when he strummed it, the sound rose through the forest like smoke from a sacred fire. Others began to hum, and before long, the whole camp was singing. It wasn't a military song. It was an old folk tune, about a farmer waiting for his wife to return from the market, about the smell of rice fields after rain. The melody carried the taste of home. Even the commander sang. His voice was rough, off-key, but full of warmth. For that one night, we weren't soldiers or revolutionaries. We were sons, brothers, and lovers, borrowing a moment of joy before the next march. I sat apart, watching the firelight dance on their faces, and I realized something. In war, songs are not a luxury. They're a kind of armor. Every verse is a promise that even if the body breaks, the spirit won't. Have you ever heard courage sung instead of shouted? Have you ever watched tired men smile through pain, just because the music refused to die? A young nurse named Lon joined us that night. Her uniform was patched and faded, but her eyes shone brighter than any metal. She sang softly, her voice weaving through the trees like a lullaby. When she finished, the forest was silent again, but not empty. It felt full, as if her voice had settled into the leaves themselves. Later, she sat beside me by the fire. She told me about the wounded she treated. Men missing limbs, men who'd forgotten how to speak. I can't save all of them, she said, but I can make them feel human before they go. I didn't know what to say, so I handed her the last piece of roasted corn. She smiled and said, "You see, even sharing hunger is a kind of love." When she left to check on her patients, I looked up through the branches. The stars blinked faintly between the leaves, like the eyes of ancestors watching over us. Somewhere far away, artillery thundered, a distant reminder that peace was still just a dream. But here, in the heart of the forest, we were building that dream one song at a time. Can you imagine building hope from nothing but breath and rhythm? Can you believe that sometimes music is how a nation heals itself? Before sleeping, I carved a few words on the bamboo wall beside my bedroll. Even the trees sing when we are not afraid. In the morning, the sunlight filtered through the canopy, and for a moment, I thought I could hear those trees humming the same tune. That night's music followed me into every battle afterward. Through the mud, the rain, the blood. Whenever the world went dark, I'd hum that old song beneath my breath, and the jungle would answer back. Because victory, I learned, doesn't always march. Sometimes it sings. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead of us, their peaks like sleeping giants under blankets of mist. We called it the long road north, though it wasn't a road at all. Just a series of trails carved by rain, footprints, and faith. We were thinner now, but harder. The jungle had shaped us. Our skin darkened by sun and smoke. Our hearts carved by silence and loss. Each man carried his life on his back. A rifle, a tin cup, a handful of rice, and a photograph folded so many times it had become part of the paper. The order was clear. Move toward the frontier. Build new bases. Link with allies beyond the border. It sounded simple when written on a piece of paper, but in the mountains, every step was a negotiation with death. The days were long marches through mud and fog. The nights were colder than memory. We crossed rivers swollen from monsoon rains, climbed ridges so steep we had to crawl, and slept wherever exhaustion dropped us. Sometimes we didn't light fires for days. The enemy's planes still circled above, hungry for heat signatures, for any sign that the forest still breathed. But the forest protected us. It had become our mother, our cathedral, our camouflage. Once, during a heavy storm, we found shelter in an abandoned hut near the border. Inside, we discovered a small shrine, a cracked statue of Kwan Am, a candle half melted beside a bowl of rice gone moldy. Our commander bowed and whispered, "She's been waiting for us." We lit the candle again. Its light flickered weakly, but it was enough to make the darkness look smaller. Have you ever felt faith in the smallest flame? Have you ever realized that even a broken statue can still bless you? By the second month, frost had begun to bite. Our boots froze stiff at night. Some men wrapped their feet in cloth. Others just walked barefoot through the mud. Still, no one turned back. We followed the sound of our own breathing, the rhythm of our hearts. Slow, steady, unstoppable. At night, around the few fires we dared to light, we shared stories to keep our spirits warm. Stories of home, of lovers waiting, of Hanoi's streets covered in yellow leaves before the war. Sometimes, the commander would tell us about other revolutions. Russia, China, places where people like us had dared to stand against giants. He said, they had their Stalingrad. Someday we'll have ours. I didn't know what Stalingrad was, but I understood what he meant. There would come a battle that would change everything. One moment when the world would finally believe what we already knew, that we were not fighting to survive. We were fighting to return. We reached the frontier at dawn. The sun rose slowly, painting the ridges gold. Below us, valleys spread like open palms, and beyond them, China. Our men cheered softly, not from triumph, but from relief. The path had nearly killed us, but it had also delivered us somewhere new, a threshold between past and future. We built our camp beside a stream that sang through the rocks. Trucks from beyond the border began to arrive, carrying crates of weapons, medicine, and hope. For the first time, we saw the possibility of a war fought on equal terms. That night, I stood watch alone, the cold biting through my uniform. I could see my breath, white against the dark. I thought of the road behind, of the rivers, the graves, the laughter under the canopy, and I whispered, "We made it." Have you ever walked so far that the horizon feels like a promise kept? Have you ever realized that endurance itself is a kind of victory? The mountains around us echoed faintly, as if answering back, and for the first time in years, I believed that the war had an ending, and that we might live to see it. We used to fight with shadows. rifles older than our fathers, grenades made from tin cans, and courage. Now, for the first time, the crates arriving from the frontier were heavy. When we opened them, the smell of oil and metal filled the air. Inside, real rifles, machine guns, ammunition belts that gleamed under the lantern light. The younger soldiers touched them like sacred relics. To them, it was proof that the world had finally begun to believe in us. But our commander said quietly, "Remember, it's not the gun that wins the war. It's the hand that refuses to drop it." And so began a new kind of training. We learned tactics, formations, signals, the language of organized war. But even with these new lessons, the heart of our fight remained the same. The jungle, the people, and the faith that time was on our side. We dug deeper trenches, built new command posts, and trained at night so the planes wouldn't see us. Lon, the nurse, still worked in her bamboo infirmary, but now she had morphine and proper bandages. When I asked if she missed the old days, she laughed softly. "No," she said, "I like it when pain meets its match." That winter, we launched our first offensive, a small operation near the border. Not much, at least on the map, but for us, it felt like turning the tide of a river. We moved through the mist, our boots silent, our breath steady. At dawn, we struck, bullets slicing the fog, grenades blooming like fire flowers. The French outpost never saw it coming. Within hours, it was over. We captured supplies, food, radios, and something greater, belief. For years, we'd been the hunted. Now, we were the ones who moved first. Have you ever felt the moment when fear shifts into resolve? Have you ever realized that the hunted can learn to hunt? After the battle, we gathered around a campfire. Our rifles rested beside us, iron and wood, cold and warm together. Someone said, "We fight with steel now." Another replied, "No, we fight with hearts wrapped in steel." I thought about that for a long time. The weapons made us stronger, yes, but what truly changed was the way we carried ourselves. We no longer fought just to survive. We fought to win. One morning, while cleaning my rifle, I caught my reflection in the barrel. My face darker, older, but my eyes clearer than ever. Behind me, the bamboo swayed gently, their thin stalks bending but never breaking. And I realized we had become like the bamboo, flexible, quiet, and impossible to uproot. The world around us was shifting. News came from the cities, protests in France, whispers of fatigue in the enemy's ranks. Even their officers seemed to age faster than the years allowed. And we were getting younger, fed by purpose instead of rations. Can you imagine hope, so strong it makes hunger feel light? Can you picture a forest teaching men how to fight with patience instead of rage? By 1951, the valleys echoed with our drums again, not the songs of retreat, but the rhythms of an army learning to advance. We moved with discipline, with grace, like the wind carrying fire. One night, as we prepared for another march, the commander looked at us and said, "The French have guns, planes, and ships, but we have something they can never understand." He paused, letting the night settle around his words. They fight to keep what isn't theirs. We fight to return what has always been ours. We raised our rifles then, iron and bamboo, side by side, and saluted the dark horizon, because we knew the next dawn wouldn't just bring light. It would bring the beginning of victory. The mountains no longer whispered, they roared. By the autumn of 1950, the valleys along the northern frontier had become alive with movement. Columns of soldiers threading through mist, lines of porters carrying shells and rice, messengers darting between command posts carved into the hillsides. It was no longer a hidden war. This was thunder made flesh. They called it the border campaign, a strike to break the chain that had choked us for years. If we succeeded, the frontier would open, the lifeline to the world beyond restored. If we failed, Viet back would fall silent forever. I remember the morning we began the assault. The fog was thick as cloth, and the sound of our boots on the wet earth. Felt like the heartbeat of something ancient awakening. We waited behind the ridgeline, rifles ready, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Then the order came. Fire. The mountains answered. Artillery shells screamed through the clouds, and the sky tore open in red and smoke. The French stronghold below, Dien, shuddered under the first wave of fire. For the first time, our guns were louder than theirs. The valley lit up like a forge. Men shouted, the ground shook, and somewhere above it all, the voice of destiny broke through the thunder. We advanced through smoke, so thick it tasted like metal. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning wood. Every step forward cost a piece of the soul. I saw comrades fall, faces I'd eaten with, sung with, joked with, now still, their eyes wide open to the storm. But there was no time to grieve. We moved like waves crashing against rock, again and again, until the rock began to crack. When the sun broke through the fog, the tricolor flag that once hung above the fortress was gone. In its place, our red banner flapped wildly in the wind, soaked with rain and blood. Have you ever seen the sky itself change sides? Have you ever heard victory roar, so loud it makes your heart ache? By nightfall, the valley was ours. We sat among the ruins, silent, exhausted, barely believing what we'd done. Lon moved among the wounded, her hands steady even as tears streaked through the dust on her face. She said nothing, but when her eyes met mine, I understood. This victory had a price we could never repay. When the radio crackled to life that night, we could barely hear the announcer's voice over the static. Dien has fallen. The frontier is open. Viet back stands victorious. Cheers erupted, hoarse, broken, but real. For once, the world would hear our name not as rebels, but as soldiers. That night, I stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The battlefield glowed faintly, smoke curling upward like incense to the dead. Below, I could still hear the river rushing, indifferent, eternal. I whispered into the wind, "We've crossed the threshold, but the road ahead will still bleed." Have you ever tasted triumph and sorrow in the same breath? Have you ever realized that every victory only deepens your promise to the fallen? From that night on, we were no longer fighting to prove we could resist. We were fighting to prove we could win. The border was open, a vein of life pulsing between us and the world. Trucks rolled in with supplies. Young recruits joined by the hundreds, and whispers of a future began to sound like plans instead of dreams. But for me, the memory of the thunder never left. Whenever the jungle went quiet again, I could still hear it. Not the echo of artillery, but the heartbeat of a nation learning to stand. That was the night we stopped hiding. That was the night the world learned to listen. The dust followed us everywhere. It clung to our uniforms, our rifles, our skin. By day's end, each man wore the same color. Not green, not brown, but the red of the earth itself. We called it the March of the Red Dust, as if the land had claimed us as its own soldiers. The road stretched endlessly, from the valleys of Chao Bang to the ridges of Twin Quang, through forests that smelled of rain and smoke, and villages where people waited by the roadside with quiet eyes and open hands. They gave us rice when they had none to spare, salt wrapped in banana leaves, sometimes just a smile. One old woman pressed my hand and said, "Take it, Khan. You're walking for all of us." We didn't carry medals. We carried promises. The columns moved in silence. Each step was measured, each whisper a risk. The French planes still prowled above, and their paratroopers hunted through the highlands. But the mountains sheltered us, like an old mother who'd seen too many of her sons go to war. At night, we camped beside streams. The sound of water replaced the sound of gunfire. Lon would boil herbs to treat blisters and fevers, her silhouette flickering against the firelight. Sometimes she sang, not war songs, but lullabies, the kind that spoke of home and harvest. It made us ache, but in a way that kept us alive. Have you ever missed a place so much that you start to carry it inside you? Have you ever realized that the sound of another's voice can keep you from forgetting who you are? The march was endless. We crossed ridges where clouds brushed our faces, waded through rivers that bit at our bones. Sometimes we buried comrades along the way, marking their graves with nothing but stones and a single bamboo cross. We told each other, they're not gone, they've just gone ahead. One evening, as we reached a small Hmong village, the children ran out to meet us. They had never seen rifles before. To them, we were heroes from a story told around the fire. They touched our hands, laughed when we let them hold our helmets. An elder came forward and offered us a single chicken, the only one they had left. When the commander refused, the old man said, "You're fighting so that we can raise more." That night, the villagers lit torches all along the ridge. Hundreds of tiny flames, flickering like stars, brought down to earth. For the first time in months, I felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire. It was belonging. The march continued, and so did the dust, rising behind us in red clouds that glowed in the evening sun. It wasn't just dirt anymore. It was memory. It was proof that we were still moving, still breathing, still writing our story with footprints instead of ink. Can you imagine a road that never ends? But you walk it anyway, because each step brings your country closer to freedom? Sometimes, I turn to look back and see the line of soldiers stretching far into the horizon. Bent underpacks, faces streaked with sweat, but eyes steady. They didn't talk much anymore. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. We are not the same boys who left Hanoi. We are the men who will one day return to it. When we reached the next valley, we set up camp beside a field of wild sunflowers. The wind carried their scent through the tents, and for a brief moment, the war felt far away. I lay there under the stars, listening to the forest breathe, and thought, maybe this is what freedom sounds like. Not trumpets, not victory parades, but the quiet rustle of a nation on the move. The years began to blur together. One season bled into the next. Rain into fog, fog into smoke, smoke into memory. We lived by the rhythm of rivers now, moving with the water, fighting beside it, crossing it when ordered, and sometimes watching it carry our fallen away. They called these the Midland campaigns. Small victories, bitter defeats, a long dance of advance and retreat. But for us, it was just another way of saying survive another year. I used to mark the months by the trees, the bamboo sprouting in spring, the cicadas screaming in summer, the dry leaves that clung stubbornly through autumn. But after a while, even the forest stopped keeping count. Time in war doesn't move forward. It circles. By 1951, our uniforms were threadbare again, our boots worn to the bone. We no longer flinched at artillery or the hum of planes overhead. You can't fear thunder forever. At some point, it just becomes weather. Our battalion moved through the Red River Delta that year. Fields drowned in mud, villages reduced to whispers. The people still helped us, but their faces carried the quiet fatigue of those who had seen too much. They gave what they could, a handful of rice, a bowl of soup, a prayer. We gave them what we had, a promise that it was not for nothing. One evening, as we crossed a small bridge over a swollen river, Lon walked beside me, her pack heavier than mine. She said, "Every year feels the same, doesn't it?" I nodded. "It does." Then she smiled, tired but real. "Maybe that's how we win. We keep repeating the same year until they stop." Her words stayed with me. War wasn't always about victory. Sometimes it was about endurance, about becoming the river that never dries, no matter how many storms try to dam it. Have you ever lived so long inside struggle that peace feels like a rumor? Have you ever looked at your reflection in muddy water and wondered who you've become? That winter, disease hit the camp. Fever spread faster than bullets. We buried 3 men in a week. There were no funerals, no priests, just the sound of the river beside us, and the commander saying softly, "They've gone ahead. We'll catch up." But the strange thing about grief in war is that it doesn't stop you. It hardens you in silence. We still cleaned our rifles. We still dug trenches. We still marched at dawn. Because stopping was the only thing worse than death. By 1953, the air itself seemed heavier, not with despair, but with waiting. Something was changing, like the pause before a monsoon breaks. Rumors of new plans circled among us. Big battles, new strategies, a fight that would end all the others. But no one dared to say it aloud. Hope, like dynamite, was dangerous when handled carelessly. One night, while standing guard, I watched the moon shimmer on the surface of a wide river. It looked like two worlds meeting, the bright and the dark, the now and the not yet. I realized that's where we lived, between the years, between the tides of loss and promise. Lon joined me, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Do you think we'll see the end?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Yes, because we're already standing in its reflection." She looked at the water, then at me, and whispered, "Then may it come soon." Have you ever stood on a bridge and felt that history was just a river? And you, a single drop trying to remember its source? That night, the wind carried the faint echo of drums from another camp upriver. A signal, maybe, or just a heartbeat reminding us we weren't alone. And for the first time in years, I felt it, the current shifting, pulling us towards something vast and final. We didn't know its name yet, but one day, the world would call it Dien. The sky above the mountains had changed. It wasn't blue anymore. It was iron, heavy, unblinking, waiting. By early 1954, every step we took carried the weight of a century. We were heading west, toward a place most of us had never heard of. Dien, a valley surrounded by mountains, a fortress carved from ambition, a name that would soon belong to history. We started the march before dawn, moving in long, quiet columns that snaked through the highlands. Each man carried his rifle, his pack, and sometimes a part of a cannon, a wheel, a barrel, a crate of shells. The big guns could not travel by road, so we made roads. I remember the sound of ropes creaking, the rhythm of hundreds of men pulling together, hands raw, feet bleeding, voices rising in breathless chants. Push, pull, one more hill. The earth gave way beneath our boots, and sometimes the guns slid back, crushing the soil, crushing us. We buried more men to the mountain than we lost to the enemy. But no one stopped, not once. At night, the jungle glowed faintly under lanterns wrapped in cloth, so the plains above couldn't see us. Lan's hands were blistered from hauling crates of ammunition. I told her she should rest. She smiled and said, "Rest comes after victory." We spoke little after that. Words were luxuries we couldn't afford. The silence between us was filled with the weight of destiny. Have you ever felt the air before a storm, when everything is still, and even your heartbeat feels too loud? That was the world before Dien. The French had fortified the valley like a fortress from another age. They called it the stronghold that cannot fall. We called it the cage. From the cliffs above, we could see their airstrip glittering under the sun, their artillery emplacements like teeth in the earth. Every bunker, every trench, every arrogant line drawn by men who believed that concrete could outlast conviction. Our commanders whispered through the night, maps spread on the ground, candles flickering over faces hollowed by exhaustion. The plan was madness, they said, to bring heavy artillery up mountains by hand, to dig tunnels beneath their guns, to fight an army with planes, tanks, and supply drops, using shovels, ropes, and willpower. But then again, so was everything we had done to survive. By March, the guns were in position, hidden in caves, camouflaged under bamboo and earth. They waited, patient as tigers in tall grass. On the eve of battle, the camp fell silent. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Men sharpened their bayonets, wrote letters that would never be sent, and stared at the stars as if trying to memorize them. Lon came to me that night. She handed me a piece of cloth, the corner of a red flag she had sewn herself. "Keep it," she said. "If we fall, it still has to rise." I tucked it into my uniform. It felt warm, alive, as if it carried the heartbeat of everyone who'd ever dreamed of this day. Have you ever stood beneath a sky so still that you knew it was only calm because something enormous was waiting to break? When the first shells thundered across the valley, the mountains shook. The echo rolled through the forests, through every trench and tunnel, and into the bones of every man who had ever believed we were destined to lose. The sky over Dien Bien wasn't just filled with smoke that day. It was filled with history being rewritten, by hands blistered from ropes, by feet torn by stone, by hearts that refused to yield. And somewhere in the chaos, I felt it. The wind changed. The valley would not be theirs for long. The thunder had begun again. Only this time, it was ours. The first shell fell just after dawn. It tore through the fog, like a scream that had been waiting 100 years to be heard. Then another, and another. Soon, the valley was nothing but thunder and dust. From our ridge, we could see the French fortress vanish beneath smoke. Every explosion lifted the earth, as if the mountains themselves were roaring back after decades of silence. For the first time, the enemy hid. Their planes circled helplessly. They could not find us. Our guns were ghosts, buried deep in the hills, speaking only when they chose to. We fired until the barrels burned. The smell of cordite mixed with rain, sweat, and fear. Lon worked the ammunition line, passing shells down the trench. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes never left the horizon. Every shot she handed us carried the same unspoken vow. This one is for home. Have you ever seen a valley breathe smoke instead of air? Have you ever felt the ground tremble like a living thing beneath your boots? By nightfall, the French outer posts, Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, were burning. We watched through binoculars as parachutes bloomed above the chaos, floating like white flowers that never touched the ground. Supply drops meant for them often landed in our trenches. We laughed quietly, eating their rations under their own stars. But the laughter never lasted. The rain came, the mud rose, and the dead refused to stay buried. We dug deeper, trenches turning into labyrinths. Every meter we advanced cost blood, not in hundreds, but in inches. You'd crawl all night just to claim a patch of earth no bigger than a doorway. And yet, somehow, each morning we were closer. We called it the war beneath the war. A siege fought not by generals, but by ghosts. Men who lived underground, eating cold rice, writing letters they'd never send. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear them talking in the dark, not about victory, but about the sound of their children laughing, the smell of home, the things that made the world worth saving. Do you know what courage sounds like? It's not shouting. It's a whisper that keeps saying, move forward, even when your hands are shaking and the earth won't stop shaking with you. The French counterattacks came hard. Machine guns rattled from the bunkers, tracer rounds carving red arcs through the rain. We moved like shadows, sliding through the mud, closing the distance meter by meter. Every crater became a shelter, every fallen comrade a reminder to crawl faster. Lon was hit on the third night. A fragment tore through her sleeve, drawing blood but missing bone. She wrapped it with a strip of her scarf, then kept loading shells as if nothing had happened. I wanted to tell her to stop, but how could I when no one else did? For 56 days, the valley became a world of thunder and whispers. We slept in our boots, ate in the rain, dreamed of nothing but silence. Sometimes, silence was worse than shellfire, because in it, you could hear the voices of those who didn't make it. When one position fell, another rose. When one gun jammed, another hand took its place. There were no heroes here, only endurance. That quiet, relentless kind that turns fear into fuel. One evening, as I watched the horizon flicker with explosions, I thought, this isn't just a battle. This is a heartbeat. Ours. The French still held the center, but the circle was closing. Our trenches had reached the edge of their airstrip. Their fortress was shrinking, and the sky above Dien was no longer theirs to command. The siege wasn't about destroying them. It was about proving that we could outlast them. That faith, when carried long enough through darkness, becomes its own kind of weapon. When dawn came, the mist hung heavy over the valley. The smoke curled upward like incense, and for a moment, I thought I heard the mountain breathe. Slow, steady, patient. Like us. The rain had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the valley was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence that comes when everything has already been decided. By May, Dien was a wound that refused to close. The French fortress, once so proud, now lay buried beneath its own arrogance. Bunkers caved in, planes rusting on the airstrip, men hiding in the mud where they had once built walls of steel. We had been fighting for 55 days. We no longer counted them. We only counted breaths, each one a small rebellion against the impossible. That morning, the fog lifted early. From our trench, I could see the enemy's command post, a dark mound of concrete and despair. Our artillery had turned it into a hill of smoke, but somewhere inside, General de Castries still held on, clinging to a map that had lost all meaning. The order came at noon. Advance. We moved, crawling, running, falling, rising again. Bullets tore through the mist. The ground shook like a living beast. And yet, through all the noise, there was something strangely calm, as if every man knew his place in the rhythm of history. Lon was beside me, bandaged arm pressed to her chest, mud streaking her face. She said nothing, but when our eyes met, I saw it. Not fear, not anger, but the quiet knowledge that we were about to end something enormous. The French fought hard. Machine guns spat fire from bunkers half buried in earth. Mortars screamed from corners of the valley, but their rhythm was breaking. You could hear it in the gaps between their shots. A fortress doesn't fall all at once. It crumbles heartbeat by heartbeat. We threw grenades into their trenches, the air filled with dust and screams. When the smoke cleared, I saw their flags burn, the colors dissolving into the same gray that had swallowed the sky. Have you ever watched the end of an empire unfold in front of you? Have you ever realized, mid-step, that you were walking through history's turning point? By late afternoon, their fire had stopped. We could hear shouting in French, desperate, broken. Then the white cloth rose, a flag trembling on the wind. For a long moment, no one moved. We didn't cheer. We didn't speak. We just stood there, muddy, bleeding, exhausted beyond words, and alive. Someone whispered, "It's over." But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of gravity, as if the world itself had exhaled. I climbed onto the ridge overlooking the valley. Smoke drifted in slow curls. Shell craters filled with rainwater reflected the sky. In that reflection, I saw faces, the ones who hadn't made it this far, the ones who'd marched through storms and never returned. Lon came up beside me. She was holding the red flag, the one she had sewn months ago. Without a word, she pressed it into my hands. I tied it to a rifle and drove it into the dirt above the enemy command post. The wind caught it. The fabric snapped once, sharp, defiant, alive. And just like that, the silence broke. The valley erupted, shouts, laughter, sobs. Men hugging, crying, falling to their knees. The ground beneath us trembled again. But this time, it was not from war. It was from release. Can you imagine the sound of joy mixed with grief? The kind that hurts because you know it was bought with everything you had? That night, the rain returned. We sat around a small fire, watching the flames flicker against the mist. Lon hummed a song I hadn't heard since the jungle days. Soft, almost a whisper, a melody that carried through the smoke and into the stars. In the distance, the guns were silent. The sky above Dien was black, but free. I thought of what our commander once said. History doesn't move with speeches. It moves with footsteps. We had taken those footsteps through mud, through fear, through loss, and somehow arrived here, at the place where victory and sorrow met. When I finally closed my eyes, I could still feel the ground humming beneath me. It wasn't the echo of battle anymore. It was something older, deeper, the heartbeat of a nation, finally breathing on its own. The thunder was gone. The sky over Dien Bien was pale and still, as if the world itself had forgotten how to make noise. We woke to silence, not the tense silence before battle, but the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The smell of smoke still lingered, and the earth was scarred with trenches, craters, and graves that no one had the strength to fill yet. It was over, but no one quite knew what to do with that truth. We wandered through the valley, past burned-out bunkers and shattered helmets. Some of the enemy's rifles still leaned against the sandbags, their barrels pointing nowhere. A few prisoners sat quietly, their faces hollow, men who had fought with the same fear we had. I looked at them and felt no hatred, just exhaustion. We had all been swallowed by the same storm. Lon was there, wrapping bandages for the last time. Her sleeve was soaked with someone else's blood. She caught my eye and said softly, "Now the real work begins." I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. We buried our dead that evening. No music, no speeches, just the rhythmic sound of shovels biting the earth. The mountain swallowed them gently, as if recognizing its own children. When the last grave was filled, I placed my helmet on the dirt and whispered, "For those who walked so we could stand." Have you ever realized that victory can sound like a sigh instead of a cheer? That peace can be heavier than war, because now you have to live with what it cost. Night came quietly. No flares, no tracer fire, just the flicker of candles beside the wounded. Someone started singing, a soft, cracked melody that floated through the camp. Others joined in, their voices low and trembling, until the song became a kind of prayer. Even the prisoners listened. Some closed their eyes. For the first time, I thought, maybe the world could heal. A few days later, we began the long march home. The road wound through mountains that had watched us fight, through rivers that had carried our pain downstream. Villagers came out to meet us, offering rice, water, and tears. Old women touched our hands as if to make sure we were real. Children ran beside us, laughing, their voices echoing off the cliffs. It felt strange to hear laughter again, like a sound from another life. Lon walked beside me, carrying her medical bag, lighter now but stained with history. She said, "When I first came to the front, I thought the hardest part would be surviving. Now I think it's remembering." Her words stayed with me, because remembering is a kind of wound too, one that never really heals, but keeps you honest about the price of what was won. When we reached the village, I saw the old river again, the one that had carried our reflections years ago. It hadn't changed. Still slow, still brown, still endless. I knelt beside it and washed my hands, watching the water carry away the dirt and blood. But no matter how long I scrubbed, my palms still felt heavy. Have you ever looked into calm water and seen both the man you were and the boy you'll never be again? The flag we had raised over Dien Bien now hung from a bamboo pole in the village square. It moved gently in the breeze, not with triumph, but with grace, as if even it understood that freedom was not loud. It was quiet, patient, alive. That night, I lay under a roof for the first time in years. The rain tapped gently on the tiles. No artillery, no shouting, no orders. Just rain. And I thought, maybe this is what heaven sounds like. Lon fell asleep beside a lantern, her head resting on her arms. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with ash and sunlight. For a moment, she looked like a child again, unburdened, free. Outside, the jungle whispered. It was the same jungle that had once hidden us, once haunted us, now breathing in peace for the first time. I closed my eyes and listened, and in the distance, I could almost hear it, the faint hum of a song beneath the canopy, the same melody we had sung years ago, when victory was still a dream, and hope was all we had. Now it was enough, because after the thunder, The silence had learned to sing,